waiting for it to come over.
Okay.
And we should be live. Just double checking. Everyone, if you're on with us, we certainly welcome you to another live edition of Let's Talk America with host Shana Thornton. I don't see us yet on Facebook. And there we are. We are live. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Talk, produced by Let's Talk America with host Shana Thornton Podcast Radio. Of course, I am Shana, your on-air host and executive producer. And we produce the programming you want to see, you want to witness, and you want to know more about. And that's our mission that we're going to do. We've done it for the last 8 years, and we're certainly going to keep it going in 2025. So excited to be on with you. Tonight, we have one amazing inspirational show, a program, an interview, one of my personal favorites. I get to interview a lot of cool people, everyone, but this young lady is one of my favorites. She is so knowledgeable about a very important subject. We're going to talk about Black history tonight here on the program. Black history is a part of world history. She is an expert at it. She's been an expert for several decades now. Tonight, we're going to horn in on one particular subject, but I'm talking about the one and only Dr. Tara White. She is on with us, and we're going to give her a virtual clap if you are watching us. And Dr. White, you know, we have a tradition here on Let's Talk America radio podcast where we ask our amazing and very dynamic and informed hosts to help us out about their resume. I've seen it. It's amazing. I know. But let's dig into something that our viewers probably want to know more about. And in the next minute and a half, share with us your personal motivation, right? You obviously were a very intelligent student. You've done well all your life. I'm sure all your academic career. You chose history in your professional endeavors, your papers, your research focuses on African American history and also women. Why was that important to you? Because after all, there's so many different parts to history. You know that. I certainly love Black history. I love other parts of history as well. But why for you was it important to horn in and share the message of African American studies?
Well, I started out as a science major, believe it or not, and have degrees in science, bachelor's degree in biology, minor in chemistry and Spanish. So many people have heard the story. And I was, I started out pre-med and then decided that wasn't necessarily what I was interested in. I really, was interested in people having access to healthcare. So I was, I decided to actually not change the major, but, just thinking about graduate school and focusing on some other things. And I ended up by fluke working at a museum. I was supposed to end up at a hospital, but the people at the hospital didn't want to work with me. So whoever that was at Grady Hospital, I'm going to thank them again. But I actually had a summer thing, a summer fellowship for to work with and shadow a COO at Grady Hospital. And this was like my last full summer in school. And so I'm going to thank that person again, whoever that person is, for not wanting to be bothered with the student. But I ended up at a museum and I fell in love with history. Now, I'd taken history in high school and I took AP history, so I'd never have to take history again, right? But I was interested in African American history as interested in me, right? And having seen myself in history, right, in the previous courses that I'd taken, with the exception of that one African American history course that I took in college. That was the only history class that I took in college, and it was this class that got me. It was intriguing, but it was actually working at a museum and being at a museum that made me think about, museums as different ways of teaching history, right? And so that was that was the shift. And then Black women's history, because believe it or not, it was by sorority, and learning the history of my sorority that got me interested in the women in this particular period. And so it was a really I went off to graduate school the first time, did a master's in history and museum studies, and I actually did a master's thesis on women in the civil rights movement in Birmingham, and after that, it was the rest is history, as they say. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Can you hear me, Doctor?
I can. I
Awesome.
can.
Had a little bit of technical issues there, but thank you. I love
Yes.
your story. I love that you were obviously a great academic student, but interesting science and wow, and ended up on history, sort of, if you will, by coincidence. But we know there's nothing by coincidence. It happened the way it was supposed to, in the sense that your brilliancy shined. And so happy for all of us that you ended up being a historian. I'm sure you would have been a great researcher or physician or whatever you were on your way to being, but certainly happy to have you on the side of history because it's an amazing journey for you. I want us to dive into it. February is Black History Month. That's known here in the United States and around the world. It's been an interesting topic lately for many people for political reasons, some trending news out there. Here at Let's Talk America, we continue to think it is clearly a part of world history because so many significant achievements and strides. Tonight, we're going to focus on Black history, in particular, the labor, Black labor that helped build and create what America looks like today. You're the perfect person for it. You and I have spoken before about the role of African American women through sororities and other civic organizations and the impact on America. Right now, we're talking about the economy and talking about labor. We do want to say for everyone watching us, we see it's a busy feed tonight. Get your questions in, get your comments in. You have a historian. She is acclaimed. She teaches at a university, okay, a very well-known one. If you've ever had an opportunity to corner a historian, ask her questions about, in particular, history, but African-American studies, this is your time. And Dr. White, I want to open up with a very important question for you. When we talk about the labor that was used and utilized to build this nation, and we know, obviously, it includes African-Americans, obviously, there were some Asian Americans, as we know, from the train on the West Coast, the train system. Let's talk about the early roots of African Americans or Africans in this country helping contribute to the economy. How significant was it when we think of slavery? How significant was that in terms of the economy and producing that economy and funds, if you will, here in the States?
Well, I'm going to preface it by saying that historians love to bookmark, right? So, although my field is not labor history, that's for the historians out there. Okay, so they will say she's not a labor historian, but no, my field is not labor history. However, what I will say is that when we think about the enslavement, enslavement was an economic system, right? You have plenty of historians who do study enslavement and the ways in which slaves the work of enslaved people, right, contributed to the economy, not just as producers of agriculture, right, but also as a product themselves. Remember, we have to remember that enslaved people were not considered people, right, before the
Oh,
law.
wow.
They were property, right? And so, you have a property, right, that is producing a commodity, Okay, so I want you to think about that. A property that has value itself, right?
Mm,
Value that can be collateralized, okay? That you could use as collateral, right? To
wow.
borrow against this, right? Against and mortgage and all of those kinds of things that you could do with money, right? So this property is producing more product, these agricultural products. In the case of, places like North Carolina and maybe Virginia, you're talking about, you're talking about tobacco.
Yeah.
You could be talking about, if you're South Carolina, rice, indigo, right? In South Carolina, back, cotton, right?
Yeah.
And so this commodity is producing a commodity, right? So that is one thing, um, and then you know this commodity reproduces, right?
Wow.
And so yeah, babies. And that's a whole nother level of, commodity production. Again, you have historians, like the work of Dana Ramey Berry, right, who actually looks at this kind of looks at the ways in which these people actually um, are commodified, right?
Yes.
And the book is called the price of their pound of flesh. I think it's the price of their pound of flesh.
Wow.
But anyways, Dr. Berry's work, looks at that and shows how they enslaved people were central to the economy of the South. But then you have other folks. You have people like Ed Baptist and Sven Becker, who look at the cotton economy. Sven Becker actually takes an international look at the cotton economy, and Ed Baptist more of an American look. But they're able to look at this and see how when you're thinking about the capitalist system, right? That this is one of the foundations, the cornerstones of this system during this particular period. When the U.S. South and the Confederate States actually decide to secede from the Union and
Okay.
become a separate entity, one of the reasons they felt they could do so was because they had that cotton economy, right? They had an economy that was the size of the economic with the economic output of a country,
I see.
right? And so, yeah, that is how strong the cotton market was. And now, we usually think about cotton in the South, right? And Southerners, but remember, the Industrial Revolution that starts in the United States is textiles, right? And so, of course, they're producing thread and cloth where you think they get the cotton,
Period.
right? Getting
Yeah.
that from the South. And
Well,
so it's important for us to see, that when it came to the creation of wealth for folks in the years before the Civil War, that, it was African American labor, right, that helped to create, an astounding amount of wealth for the South, and for the South specifically, but for the country in general. And so that's important for us to know.
You said something so interesting. You said a lot, but I want to first focus on one of the first words you said when you opened up. You said, "Remember, it was considered property producing a product," and we are in 2025, and obviously slavery was abolished officially on the books January 1st, 1865. I'm right about that, right? Not 1863, 1865, right, Doctor? Awesome.
Yes,
Look, paid attention. History.
13th Amendment. People want to say Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, come on. Anyways, that's a whole nother. Yeah,
But
it
but
does and it doesn't. It
but
does
when
and it
we
doesn't.
think
Yeah.
about when we think about it, and I must say this, obviously as a person of color, to hear you say property, right? And certainly I was educated in the school system when I went to school, educated by a family and a father that was very adamant of understanding the real history of what happened. And when it concerns to African Americans and other groups as well, let me be clear, I had a diverse education in that sense. But to hear you say considered property, and I think there's the innate racism that obviously existed in that time, right? And
Mhm.
obviously, many of us, we know there, a lot of those thoughts are not here anymore that it was in the 1800s, 1700s, even in the 1600s, right? And I do want you to talk about the first slave that has been, that was documented to come through the States, if you will,
Mhm.
African slave. We'll talk about that in 1 second. But when you talk about the racism of it, just make it clear they slaves, African slaves, African American slaves, obviously as the generations went on, were not considered humans of the flesh. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, you are right. And so what starts to develop very early, we use we throw around the date 1619, right? Because this is the day that,
Okay.
20 or so odd Negroes actually show up at Port
Yes.
Comfort, in Virginia, right? And they are actually sold to these folks for some other stuff or whatever. We use that, right? But now the truth is that Africans had been there, right? You had Spain owned parts of what became the United States and Florida and other places, and so you had like St. Augustine, the oldest city in America, right?
Mhm.
Spanish, right? And so Africans were there, and then you also had the French who were doing their own explorations. Because remember, a big chunk of that of the stuff beyond the Mississippi we bought from Napoleon, right? But the French were doing their own explorations, and they had people with them as well. So there were folks there, right? There were Africans here prior to 1619. So just to keep in mind, but became a part of the English colonies, right? And then later on became enslaved in this process. That is something that we, yeah, absolutely need to keep in mind.
Wow. I mean,
Mhm.
just it's a different thought of it because I think when people think of it today, obviously, I would hope, obviously, majority, if not all people, have certainly involved in their thinking of racism. We know racism clearly does still exist, but we think about how little the African Americans were thought of that time
Mhm.
period,
Mhm.
and what you're
Mhm.
describing is thought of as property, not even
Mhm.
considered on a human level. Do you
And
think, and this is a little bit of sociology and psychology that I'm going to put on you, and I know you've taken both those subjects before in your collegiate experience, Dr. White, but do you think perhaps when that had to be justified in the minds of those who were oppressing and enslaving, do you think that was a necessary thought process to allow one slavery to go on, one, and then for it to go on as long as it did in this nation?
well, I mean that this is about, well, in a lot of ways, this was about money, right?
Okay.
And so, that's like saying, people are going to stop selling liquor because well, liquor is an evil, and they, shouldn't make money from it. For those folks who believe that, I'm just saying,
Sure.
that's not necessarily my personal belief, but what I will say is that so people have had to have ways to justify this treatment, and especially with these Africans, quite a few of them actually, people assume that some of them did practice traditional African religions. That's true. Some of them were Muslim, right? You have had a bunch of those folks who were Muslim, a bunch who practiced traditional religions, and a bunch of and some who were Christian, right? And so people had to have ways to justify enslaving, especially folks that they were going to um, who were of the same faith. But the other part of this was really about this labor system that needed to develop in the United States to actually, or in the British colony, let me say that, in order to clear the land and make this place habitable, right, and profitable, right, for initially for the crown, and then for individual folks. And as these people came, you know, what we see is there are quite a few folks who are here early in that, 1619, those early years. Quite a few of those folks, did not remain enslaved, right? They went on and they, slavery was, and the system was really kind of muddy, right? It wasn't fully, it did not fully become what we think of it initially. Eventually you have laws that do things like, and it's the use of the law really to change the status of people, right? From folks who are, maybe closer to indentures, right? Work for a little bit and then they go, and then they're free, to settle and create communities, to folks who are, who are indentured for or enslaved, right, and for the rest of their natural life. That whole durante vita notion, right? But it takes time for that to develop. That's not what happens initially. But what we also see is we also see things like, the condition of the person, right, with their status as free or enslaved, follow their mother as opposed to their father, which is, what the entire, what that world actually thought. But of course, we understand, right, especially if you have, folks who are slave holders, right, becoming the fathers of these children, then yeah, because
I,
that would instantly change their status.
when I talk about and ask these questions, I want us. You're painting such a great picture. And if you don't know, you are watching Let's Talk America with host Shana Thornton Podcast Radio. We are spotlighting Black history, African American studies. So excited to have the one and only acclaimed historian, professor on with us, Dr. Tara White. She's a friend of the show. Very, very informed, educated, and she is breaking down, really telling us about slavery, what it was about. She, obviously racism was included in it, but she's also talking about the financial, the money part of it as well, and how people were considered at that time, giving us an idea. I want to go because as someone who loves the field of journalism and asking questions and getting to know people, there's always that human side for me, Dr. White. And I want the rest of you to get your questions in, okay? Here's a historian, ask her the questions. But when you think of the effect, and here we are, you and I, obviously African Americans, obviously coming from we're descendants of African slaves in this nation. I certainly know I am. That was traced back. Okay, I'm a native of South Carolina. The effect when we think about it, because I think obviously as time goes on, and as educational curriculum changes, right? We're all aware of that. And the focus on it is not as much as it may have been in previous times. And maybe parents don't have the time or the interest to also focus on it. And not just African American parents. I think ideally that should be all parents focusing on African American history, because it's world history along with other histories of people as well. Let me say that. That is my professional and personal opinion. With that being said, paint the picture of just how devastating slavery was. And I say that because from my speaking and conversing with younger people and millennials on it, I'm not poking at them, but I'm just being frank about it. And no one knows more than an educator who's a professor at a university teaching them. Obviously, you would know and share your experiences. But Dr. White, what I think I understand is it's almost like, when something happened, get over it. That's the notion of it. But I want you to paint a picture as best you can. And you're a wonderful storyteller. I know that from what you've written, your papers, your books. Tell us really what that is, because from what I have been taught, which is the truth of it. We're talking about devastation of rape. We're talking about devastation of murder. We're talking about devastation of molestation that was accepted and nobody investigated, right?
Mhm.
We're talking about
Absolutely.
separation of mothers from her children to
Mhm.
never know where they went. And I want you to talk about that. And I say that not to frighten anyone, but to just be frank about what slavery was. Because
Mhm.
I think we can, obviously you painted the picture of it being about money to a large degree, right? Keeping the economy going. Why, like you said, the
Mhm.
attitude of Southerners about how important cotton was in the economy of the United States. But that human factor for the mothers and fathers watching us right now, Dr. White, paint the picture, and I'm just being real as a mother,
Mhm.
of waking up in the middle of the night and an overseer or someone coming, ripping your daughter from your arms, being taken to a plantation, and never knowing where that toddler or that teen or that
Mhm.
newborn baby went. Talk about that reality, because I want all generations to understand that reality of what slavery was, because this is history.
Absolutely. Let me preface this by saying, African American history is American history. So I'm unapologetic about that. And as I told somebody, that's a hill that I definitely would die on. Amen. But what I will say is, when we think about enslavement, people use terms, like, yeah, they were treated like a slave. I think about one of my, the cult, one of those cult classics, where Smokey talked about having a bad experience with
Okay.
some marijuana and ending up in his friend's chicken coop sweating like a
Yes.
slave,
Yes.
right? But the thing is, and we poke fun at things, right? But when we think about the reality of slavery, and I love to let people know that sharecropping isn't slavery, right? Sharecropping is it's a tough system, but it wasn't slavery, right? Slavery was when someone had a bill of sale for you,
Mm,
okay, just like you have a bill of sale for your car or
mm.
your house,
Okay.
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 So that's number one. Number two is, the notion of bodily autonomy, right? That that anyone can come up to you, people can come up to you, and they
Mm,
can touch you without your permission, right?
mm,
That they can actually, look in your mouth and touch on your hair and your body, right? That idea, right, of having bodily autonomy, that we yeah these at this point, if somebody came up to you and started touching on you, you probably want to deck them. But that they did not have that, right?
mm,
They were the property of the person who owned them, right? Enslaved people were the property of people who owned them. And when they had babies,
mm,
their babies were the property of the people who owned them. Okay. Their babies did not belong to them, they belonged to the owner. Okay. And so what the owners, the slave owners felt, they worked because they understood that, although you had the legal, I'm going to use a funny word, trickeration, the legal trickeration, saying that these people were not people. They knew that they were people, right? But what I will say is that they understood that in order to keep um, a more peaceful place, you try to not sell people off, right? Because you knew that mother and that family was going to be devastated, and that was going to cause ripples in the life of this plantation community, but definitely didn't belong to her. right? The enslaved women. When you think about the institution of marriage,
Yes.
of course, there were, we talked about, we still incorporate, elements like jumping over brooms and that
Yes.
kind of thing into today's marriages. A lot of people do, but no, but that was a symbolic thing, right? But you can't marry property. Property doesn't have a legal right to be married, right? And so marriage is a legal relationship. A lot of people don't realize that. Don't, anyways. Marriage is a legal relationship, right? And you are entering into a legal relationship when you get married, and you can't do that with property. Horses and cows don't get married. Can't marry your car with another car, right? That's property. That's right. And so these people were, they didn't have, bodily autonomy. They didn't have the opportunity to, really think about, their future and their destinies in the same way that we do today. Frederick Douglass talked a lot about that, those kinds of things, right? Thinking about where he not being able to do just that. You didn't have control of your day, right? Or your future. You never knew what could happen in your life. You and with your family, your day was circumscribed by someone else. It was really about someone else,
Yeah.
right? From the time you woke up until the time you went to bed, there were plenty of enslaved women who were not able to spend time with their own children. Why? Because their job,
Yeah.
they were responsible for other people's children, right? And so their children, grew up with a connection to them, right? But not having that time, right? That they would have wanted. Now, you had people who were sold away, right? Families who were split up depending on the financial condition of the owners, right? And so the owners, in many cases, this is what if they had a creditor that they needed to pay off, right? They either would sell some folks, or you might actually even trade the person to the creditor as a way of settling that debt, right? So those were not uncommon. And in fact, there are a couple of really good databases where historians are now publishing, and I forget the author's name, but she published a book, and I think she's actually one of the people related to this digital history project called Last Seen, where these ads where people had placed this, and this is what you see in the reconstruction and post reconstruction world. You see in newspapers people placing ads for their families, right? And saying things like, I was enslaved by this person in this state, and my child was sold off to these people in that state, right? And I'm still looking for my child. And 20 years later, they're still looking for their children, right? Folks would, in the post-Reconstruction period, during Reconstruction, you had people move around. You had people move around looking for opportunities, right? But they were also moving around trying to find the people who had been sold away, right? And trying to reconnect those families, right? Reconnect those families. One of the things that we also see is,
And Dr. White,
these.
I don't want to interrupt you, but
Oh,
I do
no,
want to
go ahead.
just plug in something really quick. When
Mhm,
you said they're trying to find their family post, obviously slavery during the Reconstruction period, that we
mhm,
often have learned about, those
mhm,
who are very familiar with history, American history, and African
mhm,
American history. Just
mhm.
a reminder that the world was not connected as it is today, right?
No,
I would even
no.
hear my grandmother, who would have been 100 years old in 2024, talk about cousins and other people sort of going away, supposedly up north or Midwest, and you never hearing from them again. And this was not in the 1800s. My grandmother was in the
Absolutely,
1900s. And so just
absolutely.
a reminder to us, if you're an X or if you're a baby boomer, if you're a
Mhm,
millennial listening, or an Alpha or a
mhm,
Z, that the
mhm,
world didn't have the cell phone, you didn't have Facebook, you didn't have YouTube necessarily to keep up with someone, or a
no,
tracker on the phone or a location finder.
mhm,
They went off, and let's be real, the US Postal Service was not what it was either. People could
mhm,
write a letter and you could get the letter a year later.
mhm.
Right?
Well, you could get their letter months later, not a whole year, but months later. Yeah, you're getting that letter months later. What the railroads do in that period is make it a little bit, well, actually speed up a time a little bit, because now, before the railroads, yeah, it could be a year between the, because it's
Yes.
a dude, it's some several dudes on horses,
Yeah,
dudes on
that's a
horses,
tough
right?
job.
Yes, right. And so, but yeah, it's months and months later, right? Where you're getting a response from somebody. Um, and so, it's important for us to think about, as we think about families and Black families. As people left and went north during the Great Migration, starting immediately after World War One in the like 1917, 1918, 1919,
Yes.
and going forward, we had our and they and let me define great. So people were leaving the South in 1917, 18, 19, and forward, leaving the South to go to northern industrial centers, right? To for opportunities in the in factories and industrial jobs. So you had people, would go to places like Boston or Philadelphia or New York, or they might go to places in Connecticut or Chicago or Cincinnati or Detroit, right? For folks from Mississippi, the Mississippi route is usually Delta, Memphis,
Hmm.
Delta, Memphis, then over to Chicago, and then over to St. Louis, right? And so, because the other reason is that's the way the train went, also, right? And so you had, but people went, north to New York City. They went north to Cleveland. They went north to, all of these various places where they could find work. And in many cases, folks would, kind of get lost, right? And that is a factor of, people, kind of getting there. But what people did try to do is keep stay connected. And the thing that we have now, right? Family reunions,
Yes.
right? That really was the purpose of those, right? We think about family reunions, people were having family reunions because you had those folks go away, right? And this was a way to get them to come back, get them, keep them connected to their families,
Yeah.
right? And to pass on, well, you needed to know who all those cousins were, right? And those aunts and uncles and different
Yes.
folks that you didn't know, but also to pass on those family histories and family stories.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Which was key. You are watching Let's Talk America with host Shana Thornton. I am Shana. I am your on air host and executive producer. We're putting the spotlight on Black history, African American history, with the one and only educator and historian, Dr. Tira White, is on with us. She's breaking it down. We started off talking about slavery. She talked about 1600s, worked her way up, talking about Reconstruction, also Jim Crow. We have a great question from a youth about Jim Crow. We want to thank Denisha out of Atlanta. She's giving a hand clap for Dr. White joining us. We also thank Miss Kim, who said, Dr. White, exclamation point. You've got a fan club there, Dr. White. Cassandra out of Atlanta Metro says, this is a very interesting topic on so many levels. Cassandra, thank you for tuning in. She also gave us one thumbs up, a 100% emoji. And also we have one of our viewers, our youth viewers out of YouTube saying, how did the children learn during Jim Crow era? That's a great question. How did kids learn? Because I think for many of our students who are sitting in classrooms today, our Z's or Alphas, right, they have a professor, if you will, if they're on the collegiate level, like you, Dr. White, thinking that existed. But help us out, because I know for a lot of those kids, if they even went to school during the Jim Crow era, right? Because I certainly know I have a father who is in his late 70s, and school was not enforced then where he was, and he grew up predominantly in a segregated system and then integrated the school system in his last 2 years of high school. But I do want to point out that a lot of times those kids were not necessarily separated by grades, right? It was sort of a collective. You could be in 10th grade sitting next to a first grader. Is that true?
So so we take there are several things we take for granted, right? One thing is that we take for granted is that everybody had a school, and that's not every place had a school, and that's not necessarily the case. There were lots of places that did not have a school nearby, and let me clarify: a school for Negroes, right? Because one of the things that you see, Jim Crow is a kind of a nickname for this form of legal segregation, right? That takes place post Reconstruction, right? Where there are laws.
Quick question for you. As you talk about the schools, I do want for you to integrate this. What year, realistically, because you brought up a great point, I don't think many of us recognize, that you're saying there were places their schooling system did not exist for African-American children. And then I would even really say how solid it was even for your Caucasian counterparts in some areas of the Deep South, just being upfront about that, knowing some history as well. But can you give us an idea, lady, in terms of a year range where it would have been assumed that majority of African-American children in the Southeast, where most of your African-Americans were concentrated, obviously, where they had access to a public education? Because I think a lot of us don't realize what year those could have been.
Okay, so two things. One of the things we see in Reconstruction, right, is the creation of schools. So you have, and most schools start in churches.
Oh, wow.
Right? Most schools start in churches.
Black churches or white churches?
Yes, black churches, right? And so black churches are central to the creation of these schools. Most schools start in these and by church people. In black churches, by black church or by church people. Can't talk. And so those are two things to keep in mind, right? The American Missionary Association and other denominations are actively working during Reconstruction to create these schools to teach the freedmen and freed women to read and write. And in those schools, in many cases, you did have Freedmen's Bureau folks working with these AMA and other people, right, to help educate these folks. And you would have little kids all the way up to people who were in their 60s, 70s, 80s, learning how to read, right? Because remember, learning to read was forbidden. It was actually illegal in most places, right, for enslaved people to be taught how to read and write. And so, absolutely. And so what we have is, during Reconstruction, you have the creation of initially Freedmen's Bureau, but eventually as you have these African Americans who end up in political power, right, and are legislators and that kind of thing in Reconstruction Congresses and so forth, they create schools, these school systems and public education. right? Public education is free. Public education is
Yeah.
a product of Reconstruction. So that's
Oh,
number one,
wow.
right? Because
And is that, and just so I'm clear, was that
Mhm.
also true for Caucasian counterparts?
Absolutely,
Wow.
because they didn't have free public education either.
Wow.
Right, public education for in the years prior to the Civil War in the South, for most part, the folks who had money, right, they would send their kids off to some private academy or get a tutor. These plantation
Yeah.
owners, yeah, send them private academy, get a tutor, and then send them off to college, right? In fact, there are a bunch of folks in these Alabama plantations who end up in this state at Chapel Hill, believe it or not. And so, yeah, a lot of young plantation owner children end up at Chapel Hill. And so you have those folks, and then you have the other people, the other folks, the poorer white people they one of the things that mothers were responsible for teaching their children the rudiments, right? Read the 3 R's: read, write, and arithmetic. So there were white people who probably, during this time would have, they know, they could write their names and
Okay.
they could read at a rudimentary level, right? But really having a solid formal education,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
They didn't either. And
Okay.
so free public education in the South, right, as a product of Reconstruction and these
Wow.
African American and black and tan, black and white Republican folks, right? That actually brought everybody up. Everybody had access to school. The problem with this, right, is that as these systems, well, as Black people don't have land as a part of Reconstruction, and that helped to ensure to ensure some level of independence, right? What you see is they end up sharecropping, and of course, the person they're sharecropping from may or may not, think that don't necessarily think school is valuable, because what's valuable to them was getting that crop out, right?
Mm.
And so that man or that woman who has children on that property, they might go to school to up to sixth, maybe fifth, sixth grade, and then that's it, right? And then once those boys start getting big and they're big enough to actually help harvest the crop, then they don't need to go to school anymore, right?
Wow.
And going to school for a lot of people, a lot of those folks felt that schooling would ruin what was the saying? Too much education ruins a good farmhand, right? And so, um, folks weren't inclined to send everybody to school. Okay. And when the schools did develop, like I said, you may not have, you might have a one-room schoolhouse, like you were saying, for everybody. You might have had, different sections for, over here was the first grade, and over here was, 1 through 3, and 5 through 7, fourth and fifth, and sixth and seventh over here, right? But it really, those were catch as can, catch, basically it was as it some places better than others. Example, and the examples that I know are from my home state of Alabama. There was a community in Lowndes County, actually, in my very first job out of graduate school, was working with this local school that had a history, a fascinating history. It was called the Calhoun School. And the Calhoun School started because the people of that community petitioned Booker T. Washington to start a school in their community, because Lowndes County was poor. Well, actually, Lowndes County was very Black, had a lot of sharecropping, right? And those folks wanted their children to be able to be educated. And so Washington came there. He helped establish a school. He recruited two white women to come down, two white women and one Black woman to come down and help start the school, and thus started the Calhoun School. And, that school was for that community, that was one of the few places, right, where folks had schools.
I just want
Eventually,
to,
they,
I
they,
just want to compliment
yeah,
them really quick, Dr. White, not to interrupt, but just to stay on that topic that you're on, of how I'm so impressed with that. And I say that because we can even say that today about whatever level of education and understanding people have of any subject, right? To be upfront, that a lot of times if you're not educated, and remember, we're talking about the difference of saying how people reference not being educated today, they may be referencing college education or no higher associates or technical. At that time, we're talking about not being able to read and write, and to not be able to read and write yourself, but have a desire for your children to be educated. I am so impressed with, and I say that having an understanding of psychology, right? Because you and I know normal is what you see, right? I
that's
mean,
right.
that's with any
That's right.
where you go with anyone.
That's
And
right.
for that not to be something that was necessarily pushed on them, but to see how the power of themselves and having a glimpse of it from somebody else, of saying, if my kid can learn to read and write, they're going to have more opportunity, and maybe they can get off of this modern day plantation, is what, of course, the whole concept of what sharecropping was. And
That's
I do
right.
want to just commend those. Obviously, all those individuals are gone, those parents,
Mhm.
but just how innovative and how forward thinking they were, even though that didn't immediately benefit them per se in their own experience, but knowing they
Mhm.
wanted that for their kids. Just
Well,
blown away as a parent, I must say.
and think about this, those parents understood that if their children were educated, that they had a better chance,
Yeah.
right? I want you to, think about someone who is on a plantation sharecropping, and they've counted up the amount of, how many bales and whatever they've grown and what their output is, and they've calculated, and they know exactly what it is, right? And to have the owner come and say, "Oh no, yeah, yeah, you got this, but you did this, and you got this, and you got this, and so
Yeah.
that cancels all that out, and so I have this paper that they can't read, that says blah blah blah, and remember you signed that with your ex right there, and so you don't really have anything left, right? And you can't argue with this person,
Yeah.
right? You can't argue with the person because number one, you actually can't read what it says. But
Yes.
number two, and number two, you don't have, after Plessy, you really don't have legal standing to
That,
argue with this
yes.
person and and
Yes.
and and actually live, right? And if the person decides to shoot you down,
Correct.
I mean, there is no justice for you, right?
Correct.
And so they wanted their children to be able to do that, right? To work, and to be able to actually get paid for their labor. And that's something, if we're thinking about the impact of enslavement, besides the family, the things that happen with folks' families, besides the tremendous violence that it took to actually keep people enslaved, because human will
Yeah.
is what it is, right? And so you're gonna have to actually beat a person into submission, right?
Right.
Because human beings don't work like that, right? And so you're going to have to beat a person into submission, and you're going to have to continue to threaten them with violence,
Wow.
right, in order to keep the system. That was the system during slavery, and that was the system during Jim Crow, right? Because when these people who had been voting for 35 years, right, imagine the 13th They redo the voting rolls in 1866. So you got folks from 1866 to 1896, right? And that's Plessy. And then people in the early aughts who changed the disfranchise these people, these black voters in the South. You had people who have been voting for 30, 35 years, right? And so imagine, right? Been voting for 30, 35 years, right? And this whole thing shifts for you, right? And so you now don't have legal standing, and you can't fight back, right? So the other part of this, right, as human beings, right, it still takes that violence, this tremendous amount of blinding violence, right, to maintain white supremacy, right?
Wow.
It takes that because, Black people always understood that they were people, right? Black people always understood that they were, children of God. They were God's creation. And as God's creation, they were they were the same, right? God didn't have two creations. He had one, and he created everybody, right? This is what folks believed. And so they knew that, that whole notion of white supremacy and all that was a farce and a lie. But they could not, they did not have the legal standing to really kind of challenge that, right? And so that is one deal. But when it came to, again, wanting better for your children, we see that time and time again with these people, Black people during, in the post Reconstruction and into the 20th century South, that, the Rosenwald program, for example, where Julius Rosenwald, who was one of the founders of Sears, and owners of Sears, actually creates this program to help create Negro schools in the South. And Booker T. Washington, and I think he did, he directed the program that the people themselves have to come up with some of the money, right, for these schools, right? And so so Rosenwald would put a bunch of money in, and the community would come up with some money, and then they build these schools. But the communities came up with that money, right? Because they wanted their children to have an opportunity to go to school and to learn to read and write, because they equated education with a better life. And that's every generation since slavery. That's every generation since slavery. My own story was my grandmother, my great grandmother. My great grandmother was she was a bad sister. And she, I say that, we have a lot of very strong women in my family. And part of that is because, we're her descendants. But she owned property, and she was a businesswoman and all of that, right? But she could not read. She could not read or write. And it was my grandmother and her sister and her twin and auntie, her older sister, who taught her to write her name.
Wow.
Right. And this was my grandmother was born in 22.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and very much so. And I have a very similar story about my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, very, very close with her. And very much the same story. And she was one of the older children of her parents, and they grew up, of course, deep South, segregated South Carolina, and they were sharecroppers. Yes, they were sharecroppers. And obviously you have to, when people look back and judge or make any assumptions about any family, for any unit they come from, you also have to go to the parents and what they have been exposed to. And the reality, they were sharecroppers. Her father was very adamant about things that field, that area where they lived on being worked. And so what you have, for the most part in my grandmother's family, the older children were not educated, could not read or write, while you found the younger ones were. And I think we obviously would know why. I did want to see, talking about opportunity, Miss Kim, thank you for watching us. She says, my maternal grandparents were sharecroppers. My granny wanted more for her girls. My grandparents left in the night to get away from sharecropping. I appreciate their bravery. Thank you, Kim, for sharing that, being a modern woman yourself, certainly looking back and on that, because I think a lot of times, Kim and Dr. White, and for all of our viewers watching us, and we appreciate you all, I think so many times people sort of say, if they believe it or not, I wouldn't have stood for that. I wouldn't have been a slave. I wouldn't have done this and that. And I'll say this, I think it's easy to say that, not having a true understanding of the system that was in place. It was a system,
Absolutely.
as you eloquently said, built and ran and enforced off of fear. And not just fear of threatening, fear where those slaves were killed. After
Absolutely.
slavery, there were lynchings, there were bodies
Absolutely.
hanging. So
Absolutely.
let's be real. Yeah.
And there were people who, they say, well, I wouldn't do that. There were plenty of folks who resisted, who actually did resist, and there were plenty of folks who did not live to tell the tale.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
And at the same time, there were folks who who resisted, and Mr. Charlie said something out of the way to their wives, or was tried to rape their daughters or whatever, right? Because that was not uncommon.
Absolutely.
Domestics, people who worked as domestics,
Absolutely.
were at the beck and call of, and at the mercy of, the people they were working for.
Absolutely.
Give you an example.
And when you're talking about domestics, I just want to be clear. You're talking about during slavery and also perhaps after slavery.
I'm talking about after slavery, honey.
Okay.
I'm talking about in the late 19th and into the mid 20th century.
Yeah.
And so my grandmother's father and mother, my grandmother's mom, actually left she was a sharecropper in Bullitt County, Alabama, left Bullitt County, went to Montgomery, the city, right? And went to Montgomery at the turn of the 20th century. She was like 19 teens. She and her formerly enslaved father, who was like 90, right, went 19 teens. So he had been born in the 1820s. Had to be. And they get to Montgomery, and she opens up this she actually has a cold drink stand, and she serves food to people coming off the trains, because trains are segregated, right? And so you can't go into the dining car to eat. And so when black people were usually, the colored car was usually right next to the engine, so you get all the soot, all the hot, because the engine is hot, right? And it's coal fired or wood fired or whatever. So all of that, and there's no such thing as air conditioning, y'all. I mean, that's a modern phenomenon. Right. So they get off, these black people get off the train. They couldn't do the sleeper car, right? They had to sit up. They had, they were hungry, they were thirsty. And so she actually started serving dinner to those people, right? Enterprising. And in fact, another historian, woman, colleague, and good sister by the name of Psyche Williams Forson, wrote a book about these folks building houses out of chicken legs. Is the name of the book. But Forson's book, she talks about these kinds of things, these kinds of situations where women and women especially get into make these restaurants or cooking businesses or whatever, actually to serve a niche, to serve a need. And that's what my great grandmother did. And so she met her husband. Her husband was also was a sharecropper in Pike Road, Alabama. He came to the city, ended up working for the railroad. So he was a railroad mechanic, right? And they met. And she fell for that big, tall, chocolate man. But anyways, she's a little bitty red woman with red hair, curly red hair. And so, anyways, but they were always looking. They were looking for other better opportunities for their
Yeah.
children. So
Yeah.
one day, um, my grandpa Z, my maternal grandmother's father, one of his co-workers noticed that he would not allow his children to go and work in these homes as domestics, right? So younger women would start out, in the
Yeah.
summertime, teenagers would go and work at these houses, right, and get extra money, right, to help their families out. And my grandmother's parents forbade it, right? They would not allow them to go work in these people's houses.
Oh,
And later on, I understood why, because they were subject to be, sexually harassed, or in a lot of cases, right, to be raped or molested,
yeah.
right. And so anyways, her father was like, no. And I see, Lee, I see you don't let your girls, you think your girl's too good to go and work in somebody's house. Why don't you let your girls come and work for me one summer, right? And my great grandmother, great grandfather said, no, I don't. But I tell you what, I'll let them come and work for me if you let your daughters come work for you if you let your daughters come work for me. White dude was, he was upset. He could not believe that this Negro said this to him.
Mm,
And so he started reaching, and because they were always joshing each other,
mm,
um,
mm.
anyways, but he said that, and my grandfather said that he started reaching for his gun. Now, my grandfather always wore a Stetson hat. He always had a Stetson hat and his gun with him at all times.
Wow.
And so he told me, he said, white man, hey, listen, we around here playing with each other all the time. He said, now if you pull that out, you're gonna have to use it. And please don't believe that I'm not armed either.
Wow.
And he slowly pulled this ad out of his pocket because he knew Mr. Lee was not playing that.
Mm,
But the notion that these people understood, and I remember this conversation coming back up, right, when I was in graduate school the first time, in upstate New York. I would go over to my cousins in New Jersey to on the weekends, right, just to be with family. And my cousin was, that was her pawpaw, right?
yes.
She was the first grandbaby. That was her pawpaw. And I told her about this story, and she told me, yeah, she said, well, yeah, she's right. And she was saying, because the other thing that was coming out, speaking of your home state, was the what was breaking was the news that, Strom Thurmond had fathered this
Mhm.
daughter, right? And it was, supposedly, this love affair, da da da. And my cousin was like, no, that wasn't it. She said, listen, if I had money for every old sucker I had to beat off, uh whose house I had to work in, and had to beat them off. She said that was a common occurrence, and you had to have a certain
Well,
you know,
and I
yeah,
think to
to
that.
not be raped, and and
Yeah,
and to,
and I
yeah,
think to that story, Dr. White, and others that are very well known, that included some very high national politicians as well. I will say, and we know this from workforce protocols now. At the end of the day, and when you think of segregated America, we're even talking about more extreme than a work environment of what we describe today is what could be harassment. But you're
mhm,
talking about people that had complete societal control. And
absolutely,
you're absolutely right. Not every woman or man took it, but as you so eloquently pointed out, but truthfully, but a lot of people were also killed, right? So it wasn't just a
absolutely, and
threat. Let's be
and
clear.
and and a lot of people were killed, but this was the other thing. There were a lot of folks who ended up in other places. I'm waiting for the historian to actually come out with the book, and I'm this is me just speaking prophetically. I'm waiting for that book to emerge in the next 5 to 10 years, of those folks who had to leave the South, right,
Yes.
and be smuggled in
Yeah.
a casket, or actually
Wow.
yeah, taken out in the dead of night or whatever. There were so many people,
Yeah.
right, who
Correct.
had these kind of situations happen,
Correct.
right, and they had to leave town. And instead of dealing with, whatever, they bust Mr. Charlie in the head, and they had to leave town
Yeah.
immediately because they would have been lynched. And so
Correct.
they end up in,
Yeah.
watch this, they end up in Detroit or
Yeah.
Chicago
Yes. Yes.
or New
New
York,
York.
or
Yeah.
and we probably all have family stories of someone who either was in our family or connected to our families, right? Who had to leave the South and had to
Correct.
leave quickly in order to escape with their
Correct.
lives.
But for the young woman or the middle-aged woman or the older woman who was subject to that, we do have to keep a mindset of just where those women and men, because I'm sure that was also done to some young men as
That's right.
well, right?
That's right. That's right.
Violated, sexually harassed,
That's
forced
right.
to do things against
They
their
had
will.
no recourse. They had
Correct.
absolutely no
And,
recourse,
and
no legal recourse.
you're talking about complete societal dominance, where at the end of the day, and people can use the word love affair, which is so unfair, because when someone has control, when you are a subordinate, we all know psychologically there is no equal to that. No equal whatsoever. And that's why we define human trafficking what it is. That's why we know that people underage cannot make certain decisions, and when someone has complete societal control as well. So I do want to say that, because sometimes we've had movies sort of romanticize certain things, and that's out there. And I would just say, I think for those women and men that found themselves in that situation, realistically speaking, Dr. White, they didn't have many options.
They didn't have any options, and no legal standing,
That's
right?
right.
And you had to have legal standing if you are in a society where, and we're thinking Jim Crow South, and you can't vote. So you
That's correct.
can't vote. Where do they get the jury so where do they select juries from? They select juries from voter rolls, right? So
Yes.
you can't serve on a
That's right.
jury. And in many cases, because of the way the laws are written, you can't actually be a witness against a white person, right?
Right.
And yeah. And so, there are so many different things. You had, if you guys will think about, Emmett Till, the whole situation with Emmett Till, these guys admitted that, yeah, they killed this child, right? And there was nothing done about it.
No.
There was another senator in Mississippi who a state senator um, um, shot a man who was registered to vote, who went downtown to register to vote to the county courthouse. He came back. The state senator who knew him and was a neighbor shot him dead in broad daylight, and no one did anything about it. Why? Because he transgressed, right, the law. He not the law. He transgressed, right, this system, right? The system was that you weren't supposed to challenge um, these people, right? And so when you challenged these people, when you got out of line, right, there were, as we love to say, consequences and repercussions,
Right.
right? And those consequences and repercussions could cost you your life. And so that is, or the lives of your family. Because if somebody decide that they're just going to burn down your house, if you own your house, they're just going to go and burn your house down. Then, people made choices,
Yeah.
right, at that time based on, a lot of different factors. And, we can sit in the safety or semi-safety, because, we know that that's semi, right? In the semi-safety of our 21st century selves and say, well, if I was that, I would do. No, you don't. You
Yeah.
really don't.
Yeah.
And so that's something to ponder. Right.
And I mean, such a great conversation, so eye-opening what you're talking about. You touched obviously on history. I do have one final question for you. Before we do, I want to acknowledge all of our viewers, our YouTube viewers. Thank you. YouTube was busy tonight. Also, our Facebook viewers as well. Thank you for the comments. Stacy out of Atlanta says this is a very interesting podcast episode. Thank you, Stacy, for staying tuned in. And we thank Dr. White. And Charlotte out of Atlanta says she enjoyed it. She learned a lot. Very informative. Dr. White, you opened up, we talked about the labor, the devastating, inhumane labor of slavery. I do want to, on the labor part, when we talk about Jim Crow South, when we talk about sharecropping, realistically, and I say this because you and I know the books can say one thing and then there's another reality, right? When we talk about the abolishment of slavery, right?
Mhm,
We talk
mhm,
about Juneteenth and how
mhm.
you have African Americans in parts of the country not being told to inform slavery is over. And we know why. The ones who enslaved them are not going to say, you can go free now, right? You're talking about newspapers not being what it was and talking about generations of people not being educated either. So that's where it would have been easier to manipulate them, right? So my question to you, and it'd be a great one to close out on, when we talk about obviously the agricultural input that African Americans have had in this country. We know, hence majority of slavery and also domestic work, hence slavery and the roots of that. When did sharecropping end realistically? Because we hear about it. I know my grandparents grew up both as sharecropping children and then migrated to the larger city in South Carolina, hence where my father and aunts and uncles were born, if you will, away from the rural part where they were raised, with my grandparents raised. But when did sharecropping really subside here in the United States or in the Southeast?
So we see sharecropping system into the 60s. I mean, and God, I forget the name of the film. I forget the name of the film. There was a film made, and it was talking about, the yes, the Voting Rights Act had passed, but that people's you know lives, the material
Mm-hmm.
um position of their lives had not really changed a whole lot, right? And this was the mid to late 60s, right? Even into the 70s in some places. Again, family stories. So who was my mom, who was a dime, right? uh she was out in the 70s, living her life. And she would talk about these guys who would, this particular incident where this she ran into this guy at the club, and he was a little cute, but he was looking scared. And she was like, well, what are you afraid of? And he was like, listen, I ran away from this plantation in Lowndes County. This is
Ah,
in the 70s. And so if Thursday and Friday, or Wednesday and Thursday, because there were two guys who were like trustees of this plantation owner,
mhm.
um, and this guy named Bob Dixon was the plantation owner,
Yeah.
right? And so he told her he'd run away off of Bob Dixon's place, and was a sharecropper. And if Thursday and Friday, or Wednesday, Thursday, whatever day they were, asked she had not seen him. My mom was like, what kind of slavery time mess is this? Again, my mom grew up in the city, so she has a different orientation to this, but she's like, boy, nobody's gonna be looking for you. And the dude was like, yeah, they were. And she said, sure enough, these burly dudes come in, and they're looking for this dude, right? And this is like the 1970s, right?
Wow.
So, when we think about, especially in small towns have their own, they are their own ecosystem,
Yeah.
right? And so, what we think about, again, most of us more urban than rural, what we think about, we say we would or wouldn't do, or whatever, you the web of relations and relationships, right?
Right.
Even if you're not afraid for yourself, in a lot of those cases, you're afraid for your family
That's right.
because your family has to still, even if you leave there, you go burn Bob Dixon place down, but your parents still have to live in that
Absolutely.
area, right? And
Absolutely.
so, and because Bob Dixon is a powerful person, they're, they actually are subject to whatever from Bob Dixon, from harassment or whatever. And so,
And
folks
that could be,
have
and that could also, let's point out to those listening, could be an economic impact of your
their
father getting fired from their job.
fired from
Yeah.
their jobs. And that's what you saw during the movement. That's why people were saying, everybody, I love to say, I make this statement often on purpose, as when I first finished graduate school, when I finished graduate school the first time, like I said, I did my master's thesis on women in the movement. And you had so many people who everybody swore that they were involved in the movement. And then you talk to folks and people would be like, child, so and so was not out there with us. We knew who was out there. So and so
Correct.
was not,
Correct.
right? But I had a conversation with one person, a particular person who, I was very influential. I thought, and that person was like, this was these people's livelihoods,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
People are not going to risk their mortgage. They had mortgages to
That's
pay.
right.
They had children. They had, whatever jobs. They're not going to risk their job
Sense of
to.
immediate stability. Yeah.
That's right. And for a lot of folks, now there were people who did risk their stability
Absolutely. And we and
and
thankful
paid
for what they were able to do. We are.
and some of them paid, some enormous
Absolutely. That's
costs,
right.
right? But there were folks who yeah, who were like, counting up the cost and was like, when we think about people like, for example, when I spoke with um, um, when as I was doing my research, of course, Angela Davis is from Birmingham and her family's from Birmingham. And although her mother, Miss Sally, who I actually knew, right, from working at the Civil Rights Institute, I had an amazing conversation with her that I wish I had a tape recorder for because she was talked about when Angela was on the run, right? And we had just given tours. She was a volunteer at the Civil Rights Institute. And we had just given tours, and we sat down, and she was telling me all this stuff. But as far as being involved in the local movement, not really, right? They were members of the NAACP. And she had been a member of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, which was much more radical than either of those organizations, but was not involved in the movement in a substantial way, right? They might have given money and some support, but and so much so that when the ladies that I was working with and writing about went up to, they went up the coast and ended up at Brandeis, right, to talk about the Birmingham movement, Davis is shocked because she had heard nothing of it, right? She'd heard nothing of the movement and nothing about protests, Negroes protesting in Birmingham, right? And so, she said the cotillions and all the things, continued, right? But she was dismayed that this whole uprising was happening, right? And the folks who were leading it, namely the Reverend Shuttlesworth and Reverend
Yeah.
Nelson Smith and the other folks, did not have the entire support of all of Birmingham, right? But again, people make decisions about stuff, right? And we have to be mindful that this all or nothing. Everybody would have been involved. Everybody would have been. No,
Yes.
people make decisions, and those decisions are, people are pragmatists in
Yes.
a lot of
Yes.
cases, right?
Well, and like you said, to be pragmatic, which really means to also survive, right? And clearly we are
That's
thankful
that's
for those who were trailblazers and pioneers. We needed them. We're
That's
thankful for some of the opportunity, obviously, that exists today is due
right.
to that. But I think, and I say this realistically, when we even think about slavery, and when we think about even being on that ship, the
Mhm.
transatlantic, and not knowing for many of them what was going to happen, and some knowing the devastation of what was about to occur, you also have to remember though, and this is simple thinking, but it is a vital part of the logic. But you and I are here today
That's right.
because of the instinct to survive,
There you
right?
go.
And so let's
Not
let's
not the
keep that part in mind.
killmonger instinct to jump
That's
overboard,
what
right?
you have. Yeah,
And
you
so
have to survive for the
that's right.
legacy and for lessons too. And
There you
I
go.
commend those who were brave, and obviously we don't know what Dr. White and Shana would have been 100 years ago, or even 80 years ago, when the world our parents came from, right? But I will say, with that being said, of people what they would have done, and I'm not here to say you wouldn't have had some brave individuals, like you said, Dr. White. There were some that clearly stood their ground, but we
Mhm.
also know there were ones that also in another way lived for another day, and
That's
in
right.
other way, and you can fight different fronts of saying,
Mhm.
but I'll push my child to be educated, right?
That's right.
So there are different ways, and people have their own avenues of it. But I will go back to the basic reason why humans are here millions of years later, and it's a survival instinct when it's all
That's
said and
right.
done. That has to be part of the equation somehow.
Absolutely. And people and people wanted to make sure that they could survive, right? And
Yeah,
that they could continue to be there to take care of their
that's right.
children. And so you did have a lot of people who thought very, who thought about some of the things they did, and they were like, if I kill Mr. Charlie, if I kill Mr. Charlie, yeah, they'll probably burn down our house and shoot all of us, or lynch me, right? And so I don't want to kill Mr. Charlie so that they burn down the house and lynch me, because I want to be here for my children. But that doesn't mean that there weren't other places where there was pushback and resistance, because people did, all day, every day, burning up people's food was resistance. Burning their clothes was
Yeah,
resistance. Um, um, um,
yeah.
Suge Avery, that was
That
resistance,
famous part in the movie.
right? Or chocolate pie, uh, might be resistance,
Or from
right?
the movie.
From the movie The Help, that might be resistance, right? And so you have to know that people were constantly resisting, right? That folks weren't just kind of chilling, and everything was okay. I don't like the saying. There's a saying that younger people have is, this isn't your I am not my ancestors, baby.
Wow.
Listen, the stuff that your ancestors, you don't even know the half
That's right.
of not just what they faced and endured, but what they did. You don't know the
Yeah,
half.
that's right.
You don't know the half,
That's right.
right? And your ancestors understood that they were your ancestors. So they
Absolutely.
wanted to be around, to
Absolutely.
actually
Absolutely.
shepherd you. And we
And
are
one of the reasons why, obviously, a lot of the freedoms that do exist today is because of the sacrifices, the resiliency that the ancestors went through, experience, and embrace. So let's also certainly put that on the table. Dr. White, what a powerful conversation about African American history. Thank you so much. What we were on the spectrum. We certainly talked about as those
a
first
little bit
Africans
of
in the
everything.
United States in the 1600s, and ended obviously talking about Jim Crow, talking about sharecropping, as you pointed out, into the 1970s with your mother's own testimony of meeting a young man at that time in the 70s. Wow, wow, wow. I want to give the last statement to you in
Mhm.
60 seconds or less. Someone watching us, if you're coming in, if you watched us live, thank you. If you shared this, if you tagged someone, we encourage you to share this on your page. We're also available on YouTube. If they don't have a Facebook account, you can certainly share the link for the YouTube. Go to YouTube, search Let's Talk America with host Shana Thornton radio podcast, and
Mhm.
you'll find it there. But such a great conversation. 60 seconds or or less, Dr. White. Share with us, for those that may say, I'm not a historian, I'm not like Dr. White, I haven't studied all over the world and understand everything there is, because you can quote the dates, you know so much for African American history. And you know a lot about other histories as well. I know that you and I have conversed about that as well. So a very educated, balanced woman who's well versed about world history. Let that be known, bragging on you, and those are facts. But 60 seconds or less, Dr. White, why is it still relevant in 2025? There are a lot of things that are trending right now. There are a lot of people saying that that's the past, let it go. Why is it critical from your perspective as a professor, as an educated, accomplished woman to, or person, human being, right? I don't want it just to be women care about women's studies, African Americans care about African American studies. Why is it important for us to continue, even at home, regardless of what the school system will or will not do? Why is it important to still expose and educate and speak with children about different aspects of African American history? Take it away.
Because African American history is American history, right? And when we don't understand, we don't know and understand the full story, we can't make decisions about the future, right? Without the full story. So you have to know and you have to understand the full story in order to make decisions that work for everyone in the future. And I think that's what's one thing that's important. The other thing that's important, though, guys, is that the past, the decisions that were made in the past created the present, right? And if you don't understand what the decisions were, right, in the past and why they were made, you will not understand the current context, right? So you need to know the past in order to understand the present.
Thank you so much, Dr. White. So eloquently said. We appreciate you. May that be the last reminder. Speaking of that, we want to thank Lakeisha out of Atlanta Metro. She said, thank you for the reminders and conversation about our history. 3 exclamation points. Thank you so much, Miss Lakeisha, for tuning in with us and stay with us. What a conversation tonight. Very comprehensive. Covered different aspects of Black history, African American history. Dr. Tara White, we want to give her a virtual hand clap for all of the information, diving into it, talking about the history of it, the sociology of it, and also the psychology of it. We appreciate her well-versed and balanced view as well of sharing that with us. Let's Talk America with host Shana Thornton continues to offer real talk for real people. We'll cover those topics you want to know more about. If you enjoyed this show, catch us again. Stay with us. Go ahead and subscribe. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to our channel. If you're on Facebook, go ahead and like our page so you can make sure you're getting the notifications for our next podcast episode. But we certainly appreciate conversations like this, because after all, it's about getting the knowledge, applying the knowledge. It's up to each of us to stay educated, okay? Regardless of what a teacher in a classroom or in a university or campus, you have to continue to educate yourself. And Let's Talk America radio podcast wants to be a part of that journey. We know you're busy, but we offer podcasts 24 hours. You can catch 10 minutes of it, or you can watch the entire episode of this one, which is about 1 hour and 35 minutes with Dr. White. We're going to have her come back on again. She's been on with us before talking about other topics. We're going to have her back on. She is one of our personal favorites on this show. And you heard her say it best, history does matter, because it allows you to understand what's going on in the present, to make informed decisions, not to repeat some of the devastation of the past. And we all know world history. There are devastations of world history of the past that we should not and we bet not repeat. That's from one human to a bunch of humans watching us right now. Thank you for watching us, okay? Stay tuned and stay healthy, everyone. I know there's a lot of things, a lot of viruses, respiratory viruses going around. I hope each and every one of you, of our supporters, get well and stay well, everyone. And we'll see you again. Thank you so much for staying with us. Dr. White, you were amazing as always. Thank you, everyone.